Well, we're going to continue tonight in the book of 1 Samuel, and I am really looking forward to it. I love the genre of 1 Samuel because it's the story, much like your story and my story, of people that had to deal with difficult challenges and circumstances in life, yet what they realized is that God was with them. We left off last week with an introduction there in the first few verses in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. And it was an introduction to a family that was led by a man named Elkanah. And Elkanah had two wives, and one of them had children, and one of them didn't. Hannah was the one who didn't have children, and it says there that Elkanah loved his life. That was the love of his life. And as much as he tries to comfort her, as much as he tries to console her, you see that there in verse 8. He asks her, "Why do you weep? Why do you eat? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" As much as he tries to console and comfort her in that disappointing situation, she is still barren. He realizes and she realizes there's nothing we can do about it. And that's where faith comes in. They learned that the only way that she will have children is if God makes that possible. We're going to pick up in verse 9 tonight. And the scene here is that they are going to be traveling to Shiloh and offering sacrifices. The first thing I want you to see tonight is Hannah's vow in verses 9 through 11. And it said, and I'm going to read these verses so we can wrap our minds around them. It says, "So Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head." In verse 9 and 10, you see the occasion here. You see the setting. You see kind of the mood of the setting from some of the things that are said there in verse 9 and 10. And in verse 9, they're in Shiloh, which is that place where it would be replaced by Jerusalem. That would be the worship center of the day, was found at Shiloh. And that's where they would make their annual trip to go and observe the different feast days at Shiloh. And so it's after sacrifice, the eating and drinking, it says after they had finished, and we are introduced to a character. He's already been mentioned, but now it's a little more in depth about him. Eli, the priest, is sitting there on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle. So just keep that in mind. In verse 10, we see her emotional state. We see something about not only her emotional state, but her spiritual state as well, her spiritual status. Sometimes those two things go hand in hand. It says about her that she was in bitterness of soul, and it says she was praying. I want to tell you that is a good recommendation, that if you are in bitterness of soul, then you should pray. She is acting accordingly like a child of God should. She prays to the Lord and she's weeping. She's very upset about her barrenness. That's what she's upset about. She wants children. And you'll see there from her vow that she doesn't necessarily want children just for a selfish reason. In fact, what she's saying is, if you will give me a child, I'm going to give this child back to you. And so you see the unselfishness of the request is that she wants to give something back to the Lord. She is a sincere and genuine worshiper of God. This is how we should all be. We should all want to come and give to the Lord. Give to the Lord. Not necessarily anything that makes us look good or anything that exalts us, but she wants to have a child so bad she is willing to give up that only child and give it back to the Lord. There's a few things about her vow that she says that I want to point out to you in verse 11. It captures the ideal child of God. First of all, notice in the first few words of verse 11, she recognizes God's supremacy. She recognizes God's sovereignty. Look how she addresses God. O Lord of hosts. She is saying, you are the God of armies. You are the God of multitudes. You rule and reign over the masses of people. And so she recognizes God's position in her life. The second thing I want you to see there is in the next few lines of verse 11. It says, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant. She expresses a lot of humility there. She doesn't make a demand to God. She says, if you will. Do you hear those words? If you will. In other words, if it is your will, if this is something that you would do, then this is how I would respond. And so notice her specific request. And I intentionally worded that because in our prayers, in your prayer, we need to be specific with our requests. It's okay to, when you pray, to be specific about what you are praying about. Not just putting in prayer time and speaking in generalities, but speaking specifically about a burden to God. God is interested in your life. Notice what it says, but will give your maidservant a male child. Well, that's pretty specific, isn't it? Not just any child, but a male child. Being the parent of a male child, being a mother of a male child is the way I should say it, in this time is the biggest blessing that for womanhood in this time period. If you will give me a male child. And notice the fourth thing there in verse 11 is her vow is to dedicate this child as a Nazirite. It's the Nazirite vow. And you see that, how it's indicated, because she says, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. And so she is not just going to dedicate him to the Lord, but she is saying, I'm going to give him, and his life will be turned over to you, and he will live his entire life dedicated to you through this Nazirite vow. Well, the second thing I want you to see, that's Hannah's vow. That's Hannah's vow. The second thing I want you to see tonight is the confusion of Eli. I said something last week that might have been maybe a little bit harsh, but I'm going to say it again. Eli is a spiritual buffoon. You'll see that he can't even tell when a person is praying or if a person is drunk. In fact, he accuses her of this. Notice in verse 12 it says that And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, only her lips are moving, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you be drunk? Put your wine away from you." I'll notice there in 12 through 14 that Eli is observing her. He's watching her. She catches his eye, and he sees her mouth moving, but no sound is coming out. It's a strange scene here. It's a strange conclusion that Eli comes to. I don't know if he's used to watching drunk people or if he's not used to watching people pray. Maybe I don't know what is going on here, but he is unable to discern what is actually happening. And what is actually happening here, you know from the previous verses, is you have a woman that is distressed, and she is reaching out and calling out to God and making a strong vow to dedicate, if God would give her this child, to dedicate this child to the Lord. Something amazing is happening, yet he misinterprets it as her being intoxicated. Well, notice there, so that's why I say spiritual. He's spiritually dull, and he is the priest over Israel. And that is also probably a sad and unfortunate commentary on the days of the judges, is that this is your spiritual leader Eli, and he cannot tell the difference between someone pouring out their heart to God or someone who is intoxicated. Notice in 15 and 16, Hannah responds to Eli, and it says, "But Hannah answered and said, 'No, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord.'" There it is. "Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now." I have the feeling, and from reading the book of Judges and from Eli's response, that people like Hannah, women like Hannah, are few and far between. And so it was a rare thing to see someone pouring out their soul before the Lord. And she says in verse 15, "No, it's sorrow, not drunkenness." In verse 16, she defends her character. But notice in 17 and 18, then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace." And that's a good response, isn't it? "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." And she said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So Eli blesses her with peace and has a desire that her prayer be answered. And Hannah's, this is a little bit of a play on words in verse 18 with her name, because her name, the etymology of Hannah is one who finds favor. And so Hannah, which means finds favor, asked Eli to find favor with her. In other words, Hannah me is what she says. Find favor with me. The third thing I want you to see tonight, number 3, is that God answered. This is the best part of the message tonight. God answered this prayer. Look at verse 19. It says, "Then they rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, 'Because I have asked for him from the Lord.'" And so you see that there in verse 19, there we have this worship and then travel home. There's the return back to their home after all of this. And in the second part of verse 19, the Bible tells us that Elkanah and Hannah they know each other, which means they have husband and wife relations. And then God shows up. You know, there's a lot that people can try to do. There's a lot of efforts we can make. But unless God is in it, it will not amount to anything. And this is one of those cases where God intervenes and it says the Lord remembered her. This remembering here is not just, I had it and I lost it and I came back to it. That's not what the Lord remembered her means. What the Lord remembered her means is that God took special attention and special interest in this person, knew that she had asked for what she had asked for, and then acknowledged and granted her this request. That's what the remembered means. He granted this request with it's almost like, here is a special delivery just for you. God, and I want you to keep that in mind, that sometimes we think, I'm just one in 7 billion people. I don't matter to God. But I got news for you. You do matter to God. And there are times when God remembers you in things that you've asked for. Sometimes God will remember you when you don't even know, when you didn't ask for it. But God takes special interest in your life. Notice in verse 20, we see that Samuel is born. You see the word about conception and birth and naming of the child. Notice there in 20 one more time, process of time, Hannah conceived, she bore a son, and she called his name Samuel. Samuel, we can't be exactly precise on what his name means. There's a little bit of a discussion. It's either name of God or name is God. I tend to lean towards name of God is what Samuel means. If you'll notice, if I don't know if you've caught this when I've talked before about in the Old Testament, especially Elohim, El is the name for God. And you see Samuel. And so there you have, it's the name of God, Samuel. And so she calls him Samuel. And notice the significance. That's why it says, because I have asked for him from the Lord. In other words, this child is not the result of my good luck, my good fortune, my good genetics, my good DNA, whatever. It is the result of God working in her life. I want to leave you with 2 or 3 little things here as we come to a close. Number one, notice that this wasn't something that Hannah did just one time. This is something, it says year after year earlier in the text. In verse 3 it says that. This man, in talking about Elkanah, went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts. And as Elkanah comes year after year, he provides his wives and children with sacrifices. So the family is what's meant there in verse 3. Year after year after year, they are faithful to the Lord. Hannah undoubtedly has prayed for this child many times. She is persistent in her prayer. And that's the idea that I want to leave you with tonight, is that we need to be persistent in our prayers. Just because your prayer is not answered the first time you ask it doesn't mean you should give up. Another example of this is found in Luke chapter 18 about the persistent widow who continues to come back and come back again to the judge. So in this case, persistent prayer was answered by the tender and compassionate God of the universe. God of the whole universe, and one little person prays a prayer, but God remembers that one little person. One person matters to God. A second thing I want you to take with you tonight is that notice her intentions. She doesn't do this just for her own benefit, just for her own satisfaction and pleasure. Her intentions in this request is to give all that she could possibly give to the Lord. Even her first and only child, she was willing to take. Maybe that's the only child she would ever have. We don't know. But she's willing to take that first and only child and give it back to the Lord to be used for God's purposes. I don't know about you, but I don't give to the Lord like I should. I'm not as unselfish as Hannah is, and I would dare say that hardly any of us are that unselfish and that giving. She's a great example of giving all she could possibly give to the Lord. The third thing is this. That's Hannah. She prays persistently. She wants to give all that she can back to the Lord. And then the third thing is we learn something about God. We learn that God, once again, if we haven't already learned it, He's caring, He's compassionate, and He is truly interested in how it's going for you. You may think that, oh, I've been forgotten, it's not going good for me, and no one cares. And even feels like that maybe God has abandoned you. I want to tell you, God has not abandoned you. God cares how it goes for people. He's very interested in his own purposes, which humanity will play a vital role in the purposes of God. And you're going to see in the next few weeks, you're going to learn about this Samuel character. Samuel is a great one. Samuel is going to be a kingmaker. Samuel is going to be a warrior for God in a time where God wasn't so popular. And Samuel was just a legendary hero for God. Samuel is going to soon find out. Oh, I can already see the text there in the next couple of chapters. He's going to find out that God is interested in him. And he is going to find out how God is going to use him to accomplish His purposes. Let's bow our heads and have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we